And ESPN1420.com. As promised, joining me right now on The Great Scott Show, the Great Sports Callers Open Think Tank, ESPN NFL Nation reporter Mike Triplett, who covers the New Orleans Saints for ESPN.com. You can follow him on Twitter at Mike Triplett and check out his stuff at ESPN.com. Mike, first of all, I know you're traveling at the moment. Is your AC cranked up full blast? Because it probably needs to be.
No, and actually, I don't think we want to spend the entire time talking about this, but I have a problem with people overcompensating with the air conditioning because it's extra hot outside to go extra cold inside. And, so I'm actually sitting in my Saints office, putting my stuff away right now, wearing a hooded sweatshirt because I'm wet and sweaty from practice and sitting in the frigid air conditioning.
Wow.
I catch pneumonia.
Well, you're from Iowa. It gets colder there, but, I mean, the heat – I feel like we could spend a whole segment on this. So, but I know it was hot out at
the fans, by the way, that were out there watching training camp today, those are the diehards. They deserve to, be labeled and credited for something. The people out there watching them in a day like this on June 16th.
Hats off to them. It was the last day of Saints minicamp, and in what's been a pretty busy week in Saints news, Mike, my first question to you is, throughout minicamp, of the new faces on the team, which one stood out to you the most?
Well, I would say the most exciting one is probably going to be Michael Thomas, although I will put an asterisk on that, which is I have learned this as a reporter, too, over the number of years that I've covered the team. You really notice passers, receivers, and defensive backs in these non-padded summer practices. You don't know what the linemen are doing, offensive or defensive. You can't fairly gauge what a running back is doing, what a linebacker is doing that well. You really can just watch the passes. So it's not a big surprise that a receiver stands out, but Thomas, who we wondered could he be a red zone threat, that's exactly where he stood out a couple of times, using that big body to shield a defender and go up and high point the ball at his high point. And there were a couple of plays during these OTAs and minicamp where he caught a touchdown pass from Drew Brees in sort of a red zone drill, including one earlier this week. So that'll be exciting to see if he develops into that type of guy. And then a couple guys that I've noticed just in the last couple of days made a couple plays who I'll admit I considered afterthoughts and hadn't really written much about, but it's the new linebackers, Nate Stuper and Craig Robertson. They've really both made a couple of plays. I don't know for sure that either one will start. They've sort of taken turns with the ones while Dan Ellerby was nursing a minor injury, but they've looked like players who are going to add depth to this team. But, I still think Sheldon Rankins and Kobe Fleener have the chance to be the biggest impact newcomers. James Laurinaitis is a captain of the defense, so it's no slight on them that they haven't made highlight plays just yet.
Well, you mentioned Fleener. I mean, you haven't seen enough out of him to kind of turn your head? What has he shown?
Yeah, I mean, it's just tough in these practices. I mean, the first string offense might, have a total of 20 snaps on any given day, and they spread it around. Fleener did have one really nifty catch when they were doing a simulated 2-minute drill in the indoor facility a couple days ago, and that's always a really spirited drill because they're going at a high pace, rushing to the line of scrimmage, and it gets really competitive between the offense and the defense. And Drew Brees just tucked one of those seam routes down the middle about 25 yards down the field to Fleener. So we've seen glimpses of it, but it just hasn't been. I do remember this time last year we were all talking to Ben Watson about, hey, are you going to be the next Jimmy Graham? And all laughing, thinking we were making a big joke out of it. And it turned out he was.
Yeah, he had a heck of a year. Mike Triplett, our guest. C.J. Spiller, how's he looking health-wise? Obviously, the what's the word I'm looking for here? The hype surrounding him, the excitement has withered away after last year, but how's he looking just physically in minicamp?
Like I said, it's kind of hard to judge the running backs because nobody's trying to tackle him, but,
right.
He looks good. He's been out there pretty much every day. I think there was one day he was absent. I don't even know for sure if it was an excused absence or an injury, but he's been out there every day. Other than that, he looks completely healthy, which is obviously huge for him. And, the thing Sean Payton said early in camp was he listed him as one of the pleasant surprises, or he was asked for some pleasant surprises, and he said, "Oh, it's too early to name any of those." And then later, when he was asked about C.J. Spiller, he said, "Well, there's an answer to your question you asked earlier about pleasant surprises." So, he really made a point to say how hard he's worked and how good he looks. So, obviously, it will take a lot for the buzz to get back to where it was for C.J. Spiller, but there's at least reason for cautious optimism.
Mike Triplett, our guest, ESPN NFL Nation reporter covering the New Orleans Saints. Our guest here on ESPN1420 and .com. Mike, I want to talk a couple things defensively for the Saints. I just feel like that Hau'oli Kikaha injury is huge, and I have some friends that cover the team that don't think it's maybe they're not necessarily downplaying it, but I guess they don't think it's as significant as I do. And I just look at this team in need of a need of pass rushers, desperate need of pass rushers, and without much depth there, what's your take on the significance, how big of an impact his absence will have on the team this year?
Well, you and your friends are both right, because they're not going to miss anything that Hau'oli Kikaha has already done in the NFL. Last year he really looked so promising in the first 5-6 weeks, and then kind of faded down the stretch after he suffered an ankle injury. And he was really kind of out of position, I think, at outside linebacker. So it's not like he was an established player, and now how do you fill that void? But what they're really going to miss is he probably had the greatest potential to really take that year 2 leap and be the pass rusher that they need. They were moving him from outside linebacker to defensive end. They were going to just use him as a pass rusher, which is his specialty. Healthy, back to his natural position, that year 2 leap that everyone gets. So I think there was a lot of excitement that he could have been a double-digit sack guy or an 8-sack guy or an exciting young player for them. So it really takes a lot of the wind out of the sails to say, here was one of the exciting guys that I was really hoping might have a breakout this year, and now that opportunity is gone. And as I wrote, it reminded me 100% of what happened in 2013 with Victor Butler, when everybody thought this guy was going to be a breakout pass rusher for the Saints because he came over from Dallas where he had worked with Rob Ryan and been stuck behind DeMarcus Ware there. And, boy, the defense was in the same position. They had finished 32nd in the league the year before under Steve Spagnuolo, and Victor Butler was this new exciting guy, and then he lost for the year. And then they go on and have that great defense even without him that year. So it doesn't totally devastate them, but it does take a lot of wind out of the sails, I think.
Yeah, and Mike, you wrote as much about the Saints not really addressing the position in a big way in the offseason, and you felt like part of that was because they had, high hopes and expectations for Kikaha. Granted, it's minicamp, and you've kind of pointed out and illustrated why it's tough to draw big conclusions from what you see, but a lot of the reports were positive about Davis, tall young man, rookie last year, spent the year on IR as far as a potential pass rusher. With the asterisks, as you like to say, judging by the fact that, he can't go in there and go tackle a quarterback and do some other physical things. What did you see out of him, and do you feel like he could be one of those newcomers that makes a difference in a positive way this season?
Well, with Kikaha hurt, there's maybe an opportunity there. I think maybe the upside for Davis Toll is to have a season like maybe like a Kasim Edebali has had the last couple of years. I think very quietly, Edebali had 5 sacks last year, and I don't think people probably even realize that. He only played X amount of snaps and rotated in on third downs and then got a few here and there. And, Toll could have that kind of opportunity to be that type of player. I'd be very surprised if he was in the mix to become their starting defensive end and that, pass rusher on the opposite side of Cameron Jordan. But, I'll never say never because the opportunity is there. If somebody plays great this summer, they're going to plug him in there because they absolutely need guys who can rush a passer on that other edge.
Mike Triplett, I guess you had a story. And, again, if you're listening and you haven't read Mike's stuff, head to ESPN.com. You can find the Saints on the NFL section. If you click on the Saints homepage, you're going to find all of Mike's stuff over there. Great job covering this team from top to bottom. you had a little bit on Damian Swann, and not to spoil the whole story, I'd invite folks to read it, but reality is 3 concussions. I mean, we figure he's expecting some things out of himself. How much do you think the team's expecting out of Damian Swann, and how delicate of an approach do you take to a player that in 1 year has obviously good play on the field, but obviously concerns with his head and those injuries?
Yeah, no, it's really kind of a fascinating subject because there's been so much new information, so much new research on concussions and the long-term effects, and it's led to some players around the league, retiring at an early age, and Swann's taking the exact opposite approach. I mean, and I think his is probably still the most popular one in the NFL, which is, I was even the one who asked him the question, Boyd, have you, did you talk to a ton of doctors and dive into a lot of research and find out all you could about concussions? And he was like, not really. He said, I talked to a couple, but, nothing they said was going to change my mind. And it's almost like, ignorance is bliss. So, he's got a special protective helmet, and Sean Payton talked about trying to strengthen the neck and, things you could do. But for the most part, it's almost like a decision, do I want to play or do I not want to play? But once you're out there, I don't think there's a way you can play football and say, I'm going to play the game in a way that avoids the contact that leads to head injuries. So I think that's a tough decision for every NFL player to make, especially one who's had 3 concussions. But once you decide you're going to play, I think you kind of go all out and you go all in, and that certainly seems to be the approach he's taking.
Sticking with the DBs, a guy that has a hefty paycheck but not a lot of faith in the hearts of Saints fans, Jairus Byrd. Saints start doing some OTAs earlier this summer. He's not there practicing. Peyton says, well, we expect him to be ready for training camp. But there was some Jairus Byrd appearances this week in minicamp. What is Jairus looking like? And I guess, do you have any kind of expectations for him health-wise going into, I think, it's probably a make-or-break year for him, Mike, as far as will they keep him beyond this year or will they go ahead and cut bait?
Yeah, well, what's interesting or hard to pinpoint exactly. I don't know that he did more this week than he had done in the past. When we were at OTAs, they let the media come out, or, when they started stretching after they had done their walkthrough, and then during minicamp you get to see the whole thing. So you see the walkthrough that they do before they stretch, which is basically what it sounds like. They walk through all the plays, or maybe jog through all the plays, and Byrd was out there with the first string doing that during minicamp. So it's possible he's been doing that all summer, and then when it comes time to go full speed, that's when they take him off to the side and he works with the trainers. But the good news is that he's doing that. He's doing the walkthrough with the team, installing the entire defense as the starting free safety, and then during practice he's out there running off to the side with trainers. He doesn't look like he's being limited. He seems like he's running full speed, and they're probably just being extra cautious because that's what you're able to do this time of year. So obviously, you wanted to see him 100% from the very get-go. You wanted to hear that he was 100% on February 1st, not July 1st. But if he starts training camp out with no limitations and he gets a full training camp in, then he's still got the opportunity to say this is the healthiest he's ever been as a Saint, and we could still say the jury is still out on him. Now, if he plays a full season and they don't see the production, or if he has nagging injury after nagging injury and it just looks like, the game of football is catching up to him, then this really could be the last year. But if you want to still hold out hope that he could be a big contributor, we have not seen – this is the healthiest he's ever began a season, so you've got that positive to look at.
Mike Triplett, our guest, ESPN1420 and .com here on the Great Scott Show. Saints NFL ESPN Nation reporter Mike Triplett. Roman Harper, you mentioned Damian Swann and the Saints wanted him to strengthen his neck. Maybe he should take lessons from Roman, whose neck is still just as thick as can be. You tweeted some stuff earlier today that he had to say. Mike, could you share with us a little bit of Roman's response to being back, as he calls it, home, and ultimately, what kind of, how big of I think everyone agrees it's a positive impact in the locker room, right? I mean, the guy was voted a team captain back when he was on the team. He's an instinctive player, but on the field physically, how big of an impact do you think he can have this season?
Well, it's interesting because Sean Payton addressed that exact question. He said, you like the idea of bringing Roman Harper in here for leadership because he saw it for 8 years, and then he goes and plays for a Super Bowl team with the Carolina Panthers and has leadership, and that's all great. He says, but you don't sign a guy just for that. You can sign an assistant coach for that. He said, you have to sign Roman Harper if you have a specific vision for what package of plays he's going to play, how many, do you have 20 to 25 snaps for this guy that's going to help this team? And he said their decision was yes. He said, and not even a question of, does he make the team or not at training camp? Because we don't want to do this and then cut the guy at the end of training camp. So they are specifically saying they envision a role for him to play 20-plus snaps on this team to make this roster out of training camp, or they wouldn't have done this. So their answer is yes. And they're doing a lot of free safety stuff out there. And look, they have mentioned, both Sean Payton and Dennis Allen quickly mentioned, close to the ball, not away from the ball, close to the line of scrimmage, not in deep coverage. I really think he'll do the same things that he always thrived at. And my thing I always said about Roman Harper was, if he was just called an outside linebacker, he'd probably be everybody's favorite Saints player because that's the way he played the game. He covered tight ends well, in the short term, if not running down the field with the Jimmy Grahams of the world, but covered tight ends well, hit like crazy, their best blitzer, their best fumble forcer. He could lead the team in sacks some years. That's the style of player he is. So if you think of him as a rotational outside linebacker who can hit really hard, your expectations are in the right place for Roman Harper.
No doubt. And he went to 2 Pro Bowls for a reason, and he's a guy that likely, I think, someday, Mike, will go into the New Orleans Saints Hall of Fame. I mean, he's got a lot of tread on the tires. We'll see how he can do this upcoming season. You mentioned we haven't mentioned number 9 yet, Mr. Drew Brees. I don't want to get into his contract yet. I do want to get your thoughts on it though before we wrap it up. His philosophy about 2-point conversions. Ben Roethlisberger says, I hope we do it every time, and Brees says, I think we can do it every time. He goes on national radio shows and says we'd make it more than 50% of the time. Is this more sizzle than steak? Is this more, look, it's the summertime, we need headlines? Or could you actually see Sean Payton kind of, with the way Payton has handled kickers in the past, could you see him going down this rabbit hole a little bit?
I think it's more sizzle than steak because of how it was presented to Drew Brees. Ben Roethlisberger came out and said that stuff, and Brees was like, well, what do you think? And he's like, sure, yeah. I mean, he kind of reluctantly, not reluctantly, but, he's like, yeah, I could see that. I could see a case being made for that. Sure, yeah, I'd do that. More so than it sounding like something that they've really been drawing up. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you take the frustration the Saints have had with field goal kickers. Now, I mean, I think they only missed 1 extra point last year, if I remember right, and maybe 1 in the preseason as well. Or it was the year before where they missed 1 in the preseason when it was still an experiment.
Right.
So it's not like they're missing 4 or 5 of these extra points in Sean Payton. But absolutely, I would not be surprised. I think I even joked last year. I wouldn't be surprised if the Saints become the first team to just say, we're not going to keep a kicker on the 53-man roster, period. Thomas Morstead will do our kickoffs, and we will never attempt a field goal or an extra point, because the percentages are probably in favor of go for it or punt when it comes to the combination of how successful Drew Brees and the Saints offense is when they go for those 4th and shorts, and they're a bit, I wouldn't bet against them being able to convert more than half of their 2-point conversions, and you combine that with the frustration that they've had with their kickers. But I don't expect it to happen. But it also wouldn't shock me if they became pioneers in the advent of the 2-point era. Speaking
of the frustration with kickers, which has kind of been the kryptonite for one Sean Payton. I mean, he's had 10 in as many seasons as head coach. How's that battle looking? One thing you can, I guess, see in minicamp is guys kicking, right? It's not like they have to do much else.
Right. Although I am purposely not paying close attention to it and not charting it every day, because another thing I've learned covering this team for more than 10 years is it doesn't matter if a guy – the only way it would matter if a guy was way behind right now is he might get cut if they like another guy that they find on the street in the meantime. But This decision is going to come down to who comes up when the lights are on in the preseason games. So the stuff they're doing doesn't really matter right now. Although, as you know, some people are running to the opposite end of the field so they can accurately gauge who's making them and who's missing them and charting them in practice. The percentages have been lower than you'd like. It sounds like, with each guy taking their turns missing a few during OTAs and minicamp so far. So nobody is turning into a Hall of Fame kicker just yet at Saints camp, but there's still time.
The kicking conundrum for the New Orleans Saints continues. Mike Triplett is our guest. All right, back to number 9 for a moment. You think Drew Brees goes into the season without an extension, or does this thing get worked out sometime between now and September the 11th?
I think it will get done. But I also thought it would get done before now. But I think, look, these things need deadlines to get done. There hasn't been a deadline, and I think partly that was by design. I don't think the Saints wanted to be backed into a corner where they had to get a deal done to get under the salary cap. So they got under the salary cap different ways so they could be in an even negotiating position. And now they're in even negotiating positions. I mean, Drew Brees holds a lot of the cards because he'd be in high demand, and quarterbacks make silly money now. And if Brock Osweiler got $18 million, then Drew Brees might get $25 million next year. But Brees also is the player who would be risking things if he played this season and could potentially suffer an injury. So I think there's plenty of incentive to get this deal done before this season starts from both sides. And I also think there's incentive for both sides to not make it the story of the season. Like, oh, could this be Drew Brees' last year? And, have people dissecting it and writing about it every Sunday. So I think there is plenty of incentive to say the day they report to training camp is an actual deadline, and let's work toward that deadline and see if we can't get a deal done. So that's my guess. But again, it's possible. We've seen these sides be stubborn before, and it's not a real hard, fast deadline, so maybe it doesn't get done by then.
Mike Triplett is our guest. Just a few more for you, Mike. Robert Meacham, 7 of his 8 years he's spent in New Orleans. He's 31. He didn't play last year. It's mini camps, and I'm as guilty as anybody. I'm writing stories about Meacham and wearing 12 one day and missing it the next and back in 17 the next. Is this a story of kind of nostalgia coupled with it's mini camp, or could Meacham actually turn this tryout and make the Saints roster?
Well, it's possible that he could make the team. I don't think they're just doing it as a favor to him.
Gotcha.
I think he has a leg up on other potential guys who they could sign because they know him, they know his strengths, they know his weaknesses, they know how they would use him and where they would not use him, and all that stuff is an advantage. And he's obviously stuck around here for a while and beat out some younger guys because he runs the right routes, knows where to go in this offense, and is a standout blocker and all those things. They just signed a guy, Vincent Brown, who's had an injury-laden history, a veteran, who hasn't really caught on with the team for the last couple of years. So if they could sign him, why couldn't they sign him Meacham? But all that being said, I'd paint him as a long shot, and even if they did sign him to their 90-man roster, I'd call him a long shot to make the 53-man roster. But, obviously he's got a chance.
And lastly, Mike, Steve Gleason, his heroism obviously is undeniable, and this week he premiered in New Orleans his documentary biopic, Gleason. Were you able to see it, or were you just covering kind of – so how was it?
It's really good, and it's really well done, and it's everything you've heard, every emotion. You're going to laugh a lot out loud, and you're going to smile big at some Saints memories. And I really appreciated the footage of Steve when he was in the early years before he was diagnosed with ALS, and remembering what he was like and why the city fell in love with him in the first place, and then the triumphs since he's been diagnosed with ALS and the things he's done. But you also see the heartache, the difficulty, wow, this is what life is like every day, and they really do a good job of saying that both Steve and his wife Michelle, who is a hero in this movie too, even though she specifically says, I don't want anyone to call me a hero or a saint, that they live with that. It's amazing. People are out there every day saying you're my hero, and then we come home and we're dealing with nurses having to come over because of bathroom emergencies and stuff like that, and fights between them when stress gets high, and taking care of a child and Steve at the same time. And so it's really, really revealing. And they don't just do the Hollywood version of a hero movie. They let you know what their lives are like as one of the most unique couples in New Orleans and America.
I can't wait to see it. And then Steve, in typical Steve fashion, still showing off his wit and humor. Calls Sean Payton a word that we can't say on the radio, but Sean gets a little choked up, and then Gleason immediately brings the house down with laughter, right?
Yeah, so, and look, I mean, it was very symbolic of the movie, too. Just, you go from one emotion to the next. And, they had Peyton speak on the stage right afterward, and Peyton had just seen it for the first time, and he was a little choked up and lost for words. And, I mean, if you've been around Steve, you know that it takes him a moment to, type what he's going to say, and then the computer-generated voice. So during this silent pause in the entire theater, all of a sudden you get Steve. The PG-rated word that I use is you get Steve saying, "What a wimp," and the entire place just breaks out into laughter. And then Peyton has to admit, yes, I am.
Good stuff. Mike Triplett, always great talking to you, my friend. Folks, follow him on Twitter, @Mike Triplett. If you're a Saints fan, my guess is you already read his stuff every day. But if you're not, head to ESPN.com. Click on the Saints homepage. Go read all his stuff. Great coverage. Top to bottom in regards to the New Orleans Saints. Mike, hope we can talk to you again sometime during the preseason, but I would tell you to try to stay cool, but it seems like your theory is to try to stay warm when it's really hot outside, so stay warm.
Something in between, yeah.
Wait, what was that?
Something in between. Let's just keep it 70 degrees at all times.
All right, lukewarm well wishes for Mike Triplett. Mike, man, as always, we really appreciate the time and hope we can do it again in the future.
All right. Thank you, man.
You got it.